Hey folks, today I've got a complete deep dive comparison between the Fitbit Charge 5 and the Garmin Vivosmart 5. Now this video is divided up into three kind of core areas, and each area has a bunch of miniature areas inside of it. The first core area is general stuff, things like pricing and battery and all that kind of generic stuff. Then we get into all the health features, and then after that, all the sports features. You can use the YouTube chapters along the bottom down there to figure out which section you want, and it's as simple as that. I've also got a comparison post written as well that you'll find linked down the bottom there that is even more information that I just simply couldn't fit in this video. So first up in the general section is the price. This is an easy one. The Garmin is $149, and so is the Fitbit Charge 5. But at the same time, that's not really true. The Fitbit Charge 5 is on sale basically perpetually for about $129. Like 70+% of the time, it's on sale for $129. So practically speaking, it's $130 versus $150. The most noticeable difference between these two devices is the display itself. If you look at the Fitbit Charge 5, it's got this brilliant AMOLED display versus the Garmin here has a black and white display. Both of these displays are touchscreen. You can see I can swipe up and down like this. Same goes here on the Garmin side. And also, by the way, I've got reviews on both these individually where I go into the individual features. This is more about just the comparison. So the touchscreens on both of these work pretty well. In terms of visibility though, that seems to vary quite a bit. Outdoors, the Charge 5 has no problems whatsoever. It's really good compared to like especially the past Charge series like the Charge 4 and Charge everything else kind of sucked. Visibility is awesome in bright sunlight. On the Garmin side, the visibility is not awesome in bright sunlight. It is totally fine indoors, but there's some of the smaller data fields, like during workouts, in bright sun that's just impossible to see. The next thing you might have been noticing here is the displays have been dimming and turning off automatically. That's because both of these displays are not always on by default, which means that they will turn off just like that right there, and dim, eventually turn off as well to conserve battery. In Fitbit's case though, you can change it to an always on display. You do take a battery hit for that, but I find it just incredibly worthwhile, so it's just always on all the time. Speaking of battery, both of them claim 7 days, and I find that pretty realistic across both of them. Fitbit's usually very conservative in their battery estimates, and that holds true here, and Garmin seems to be in the same boat as well. Of course, that will vary depending on all the features you use. More workouts mean usually less battery time, and if you change the display settings on the Fitbit Charge 5, that will of course burn more battery as well. Okay, and a quick note, if you're finding this useful or interesting, if you could whack that like button, it really does help out this video and the channel quite a bit. Next, both of these do have swappable bands. In case of Fitbit, you just simply pop off this little clasp right there and you're good to go. In case of both sides, so in the event you do break it, it's no problem, you just gotta swap it off. And same with Garmin, it just simply pops out. This was new in the Vivosmart 5, something previously in the past, they were locked in there. Next, a couple quickies here. Both of them support Android and iOS, so no problems on either platform. There are some differences down the road in the health tracking that we'll talk about. Both of them have smartphone notifications that you can see. They're obviously way easier to see on the Fit because it's a bigger screen and it's just got more clarity and more color and all that kind of goodness, but technically speaking, you do get notifications on both of them just fine. You can clear those notifications, but you can't respond on either platform to anyone else. Both of them have alarms and timers, so you can set an alarm to wake up at a certain time every single morning or certain days of the week, for example. But the big difference between these two, the last difference in the general category, is contactless payments. Only the Fitbit Charge 5 has contactless payments. I can go ahead, I can swipe down here from the top, I can see payments right there, versus Garmin has not put their Garmin Pay in this particular device, which is definitely a weird omission because, again, it's here for cheaper and Garmin has this in many other devices. So if that is a big ticket item for you, it's something to consider. So next we're going to transition into the health side of it, health tracking, if you will, starting off with like the daily stuff and then getting in more advanced bits on the health side. The first bit, of course, is daily activity tracking in terms of steps. You'll see both of them do that just fine. You can see right here, if I just tap this to wake this back up again, there's my steps along the bottom on both of them. And in fact, I can tap both on the bottom to change the metrics there. Very, very similar in this manner. And then both of them, I can swipe up like this to get to more detailed kind of overviews of the day. Again, very, very similar between the two. I'm going to get that straightened back out there for you. These all kind of have like widgets that you can adjust that show more or less your current daily stats. There's my sleep, for example. There's weather on this side. And they vary slightly between the two of them. And then if you transition over to the app side of it, it's very similar there as well for the basics like steps. Neither have stair tracking though, so keep that in mind. But in terms of those apps, you can see your current steps for the day as well as your past steps just fine. And there are sections of the Fitbit app that I'll talk about where you are limited by premium, but everything you will see in this review, unless I've explicitly said otherwise, is using the non-premium edition. In fact, my app is not configured for premium right now, so if I show you premium stuff, it's from a number of months ago when I was subscribed. Next, both of them have basic sleep tracking as well as advanced sleep tracking. You can see it right here on the watch itself showing me there. There's my sleep time from last night, 4.5 hours versus 6.5 hours. I was about in the middle there. We'll just call that splitsies. 67 for my sleep score here. And if I tap on this, I get 80 for my sleep score over there. Now in the case of the Fitbit, I can't can't see the phases, my sleep stages, if you will, on the watch itself. I can see them on the Garmin, so you see those there. But both of them allow me to see that on the app just fine. And I can go back as far as I want on both apps. So there's no difference in that particular aspect, both for the sleep times, the sleep scores, as well as the sleep stages. In terms of the accuracy of those sleep stages, I generally put both these in the camp of like barely struggable, probably not accurate, but maybe interesting. There's just not a lot of data there that shows either of these two companies are super accurate when it comes to sleep stages or sleep phases. Next, there's respiration rate or breathing rate. Both of them have it, but in slightly different ways. In the case of the Garmin, you can see on the watch itself, right there at the very bottom. In this case, it's going to try to measure. Obviously, it's not on my wrist, but I'm going to tap this again, and I can see it right there, the last 7-day average. And I can also swipe over to do some breath work. You can do breath work on the Fitbit Charge 5 as well, so no problems there. And when it comes to the app, you can see your breathing rate at night from both companies. You can also see it during the day from Garmin. In the case of Fitbit, you're limited to 7 days of activity. This is sort of one of those first Fitbit premium blocks, where if you want more than 7 days of history for breathing rate, you have to subscribe to Fitbit's premium service, whereas Garmin, that's completely free. And that's really been one of Garmin's big pushes over the last few months, is becoming more assertive and saying, hey, everything is free, you don't require a subscription to access your own data, versus Fitbit's kind of put more and more things effectively behind that paywall. In that same camp is your SpO2 score, or your blood oxygenation level. Garmin calls it pulse ox, but it's the same thing here. In the case of Fitbit, they're reading that at night. In the case of Garmin, you can choose to read that at night, 24/7, or just simply manual or even off altogether. So in Fitbit's case, you can see my score last night was a more believable 93. In the case of Garmin's, it was a less believable 88%. Both these you can track in the app. Again, though, with Fitbit, you're limited to 7 days of past SpO2 readings, versus Garmin will show you history for as long as you darn well want it. Garmin will also allow you to divide up that history between kind of daytime as well as nighttime stuff, so you can really dig into the depths there if you really need to. Still, I would say SpO2 tracking on most wearables today, not all wearables, but most wearables, is more of a marketing gimmick than it is a real world thing. If you're really truly concerned about SpO2 tracking, I would probably do it under more of your own terms, meaning doing static spot checks, which is something Garmin does support, but this particular sensor isn't super accurate for it. Whereas the Fitbit Charge, you cannot do a spot check under your own terms, which means that it's just going to do it at night, which means you can't control all the variables around it. Next, there's ECG, which is electrocardiogram. That's something that Fitbit rolled out last year to the Fitbit Charge 5, as well as their past devices previous to that, and allows you to go ahead and get an ECG reading and then detect for AFib. And from there, it'll export out a PDF for a doctor to read or any other medical professional. Garmin does not have that at all on any of the devices today in production, though if you saw my video up there on Garmin's ECG efforts, they are certainly working on it, but this hardware is definitely not capable of that if that would ever happen. So just keep that in mind. Again, a bit of a marketing reality check here. ECG is incredibly useful for that like 1 to 3% of the population that wants to use that on a very frequent basis. For the rest of us, we're probably just going to do it once and go, oh, that was kind of cool. So just keep that in mind. I wouldn't let that be a driving factor unless you believe you need it to be a driving factor. Next, both these have stress measurement, but they vary quite differently in how they display it or even record it. In the case of Garmin, you can see your stress level at any one point in time just by going into that little stress option right there. It'll measure it instantly and then record that as well to the app. In the case of Fitbit, it produces a stress score that you see each morning when you wake up for effectively the previous day. Contextually speaking, Garmin's is just way more useful, and I find it generally pretty accurate. Again, it's not like super scientifically backed, but I find that for the most part, when I'm stressed, it'll show me as highly stressed, and when I'm more relaxed, it'll show me with low stress. So it's something that you can maybe use to kind of look historically at stuff and figure out what does or doesn't stress you. Meanwhile, on the Fitbit side, their score does have a breakdown of what contributes to that stress, but the breakdown is only available if you're a Fitbit premium subscriber. So it's fairly opaque otherwise, but it is at least a score you can reference, and it's there certainly for free and does not have a 7-day cap on it. Next, there's skin temperature. Fitbit has that. If you're a non-premium subscriber, you're limited to 7 days of skin temperature data, although it's not your exact skin temperature, it's your skin temperature variation from your baseline. So it's showing whether you're trending hotter than normal or colder than normal. In the case of Garmin, they simply don't have that at all. Another feature Fitbit has that Garmin is not in this particular range is HRV readings. Now, in the case of Fitbit, they'll show you the last 7 days for free, and again, you got to pay for more than that. But that reading is taken during night. You can't control exactly when that reading happens, so that's something to keep in mind. In the case of Garmin, they don't have it at this price point. They do have an HRV check option at their higher-end watches, just introduced in the last year or so. But unfortunately, they didn't put it in this particular unit because the sensor here is a little bit older. Speaking of which, just because I didn't mention it earlier on, both these do have optical heart rate sensors on the back right there, and they perform relatively similar things. For the majority of the day, they'll sit there in kind of a lower power mode, constantly tracking your heart rate 24/7. If I put my finger over them, you should go ahead and see them light up light green in just a second. There we go. See a little bit of green there. Again, different sensor packages and designs. They then use red for doing blood oxygenation levels. You see that primarily at night for both these units. Both these have resting heart rate options to see what your resting heart rate's been trending over time. It's a great indicator, for example, if you're getting sick or too fatigued. In the case of Fitbit, however, again, 7-day cap, unless you're a subscriber. In the case of Garmin, you can go back as far as you darn well want. Next, both units have the ability to set high and low heart rate alerts for non-workout usage. So basically, if you're just sitting here like this and your heart rate spikes to 150, both units can alert you that. And then inversely, if your heart rate drops to say 38, they can alert you that. And in both cases, both of them are configurable and both of them are free. Next, both companies have hydration tracking in their respective apps, so you can track how much water you're getting in. In the case of Garmin, you can also track hydration on the watch itself. So you can go and just simply tap as you drink a cup of water, and then it records that here and then sends it onto your app. Next, both companies have some sort of readiness score. In the case of Fitbit, they call it their Fitbit Daily Readiness. In the case of Garmin, they call it Body Battery. Fitbit charges you for that, though. That is part of their premium subscription service. Takes a bunch of different metrics in there and spits it out and gives you a score for the day. I've got an entire video on how it works up in the corner there. In the case of Garmin, it does the same sort of taking all those metrics, pull it in, and give you a score each day. But it's also a live score, so I can go right now and swipe on down, find my Body Battery score. There it is at the bottom. And then look at that, there's the last 4 hours going from 29 down to 17. I find that the Garmin Body Battery score is actually very, very accurate in terms of how I feel. This is about right. It's been a very long day and it's still a bit longer. Garmin's case, it's totally free. You can look at all your historical data, all the kind of stuff that we've talked about being free. In the case of Fitbit, it's a bit more advanced in terms of what they show you after the fact. It's again, kind of the day after sort of thing, but that does require payment. Okay, the last item before we exit the health and go into sports, which is oddly enough, Apple Health compatibility. In the case of Garmin, they'll spit out a vast majority of the metrics to Apple Health. Not every single one, but a fair number of them to Apple Health. In the case of Fitbit, they don't do anything Apple Health at all. In fact, they've never gone ahead and contributed to Apple Health. So if you're on an iPhone and you do want your data in Apple Health, that's something to consider. I don't expect that to change, given this was a stance Fitbit took pre-Google buying them, and now that Google has bought them, that's certainly not something I would expect them to go ahead and add. Okay, let's talk sports, my camp here. So first off is the most obvious one, which is built-in GPS. In the case of the Fitbit Charge 5, it does have built-in GPS. In the case of the Garmin, it does not. Both of them have connected GPS options, which means they can use your phone if you want to, instead of the GPS built into the Fitbit Charge 5. And again, there's no GPS in the Garmin. Now, if you've seen my full in-depth review video of the Fitbit Charge 5, you'll know that the GPS that's built into this is a hot dumpster fire of a mess. And primarily to boil that whole thing down to like a 10-second version, you have to choose between accuracy of the heart rate or accuracy of the GPS because of the way the antennas are designed, that when you tighten it up for better heart rate, you lose antenna access to the sky and thus you lose GPS. Now, that does not apply if you use your phone in the connected GPS mode of the Charge 5. So in that scenario, when I was testing this over the last week or so side by side, it was largely pretty much equal between the two of them because it's using the same source. There was some failures though from both companies in connected GPS. In the case of Garmin on one ride, it was 20 kilometers too long. In the case of Fitbit, it ended after just 1 kilometer. But on my runs though, where my phone was just in my pocket, it did much better than my phone in my back jersey pocket for cycling. Point being, if you're using connected GPS, meaning you're using your phone's GPS for both of them, I would consider that category a wash. If, however, you want to go and use the GPS in the unit itself and not depend on your phones, Fitbit works fine as long as it's loose enough that your heart rate's not very useful anymore. And unfortunately, in the Fitbit's case, you cannot use an external heart rate strap. And you can't do that with Garmin either. Neither of these units support external heart rate straps. So that then gets the next question is how accurate is the optical heart rate sensor on the bottom there for workouts? Now, as I mentioned earlier on, for day-to-day usage, like just sitting around like this, both of them are plenty accurate, and I see no difference between the two of them from an optical heart rate standpoint. But during workouts, it's very clear the Garmin's optical heart rate sensor is simply better. Now, how much better depends on how intense that workout is and how much movement you have. For a steady-state workout where your body's not moving a lot, I find them pretty similar. In fact, I did some Peloton workouts this past weekend, even high-intensity stuff, where there was basically identical between the two of them because I'm not moving a whole lot. Versus when I went outside and ran interval workouts, the Charge 5 often floundered, versus the Garmin was pretty much spot on with the chest strap. And again, I've got entire deep dive charts and all the kind of fun stuff that you can look at if you want to, linked down below or up there, somewhere on the screen. Assuming you do trust the heart rate in this for your workout, what about broadcasting it to third-party apps? For example, broadcasting it to Peloton or Strava or anything else that you want. In the case of the Garmin, I can do that. They allow you to broadcast over Bluetooth Smart as well as AMP+, versus the Fitbit Charge 5 does not allow any sort of broadcasting outbound. These days, that kind of feels like it's a bit of a table stakes on wearables. Most companies allow that in some way, shape, or form, so it's a bit of a disappointment that Fitbit doesn't allow that. Next, in terms of sport profiles, they're relatively similar, but also kind of a little bit different. So in the case of the maximum current profiles you can load on each one, it's maximum of 5 loaded onto the Fitbit Charge 5 and 10 onto the Vivosmart 5. However, Fitbit has 21 different sport profiles to choose from, and Garmin has 14 to choose from. And then when it comes to customization of the sport profiles, at a high level, they're kind of similar. You can basically customize a certain amount of portion of the data page for each one of them, depending on your sport profile, and then one portion of the page stays the same. The main difference, though, is that in Garmin's case, that main data field in the middle is the bigger one that says the timer. You cannot change that at all. So your customizations are the upper and lower portion, and those are the portions that are really hard to read outside in bright sunlight conditions. Again, indoors, no problem at all. On the bike, anything like that, no problem. But outdoors in the sun, that basically just that text disappears because it's so thin. And if I look at the sport profiles a little more deeply, it takes up in like the interval timer. In the case of Fitbit, they do have an interval timer that says, hey, here's your recovery, and here's your work interval, and just repeat over and over again. Versus Garmin has a new HIIT timers in there, and that allows you to get in different categories of HIIT timers and have that be much more complex. Still, whether or not you want to mess with all that on a wearable of this size while you're trying to do a workout may be kind of a little more debatable. Now, one Garmin-only feature is live tracking during workouts. This means that it'll go ahead and automatically send a link to your friends and family as defined in the Garmin Connect app ahead of time. So this does require your phone with you, but it shows your current location, it also shows your current pace, and even heart rate sensor data like you see right there as you go throughout the workout. So once you finish with your workout, you got a summary on the watch itself, about the same on both of them, and then you also get that synced up to the different app platforms. In the case of Garmin, you're going to get way more detailed information than you will with Fitbit. Fitbit's information is just fine, and it syncs off to platforms like Strava, just like Garmin does. But in the case of Garmin, you're going to basically get the exact same data sets that you would from a $1,000 Garmin watch. Now, there's some metrics, of course, that aren't going to be here from a $1,000 Garmin watch, but the core of all that stuff is essentially the same. If I were to show you them side by side, most people would not be able to pick out at a quick glance or even a steady, healthy look at it which ones are different. And then finally, two little features that Garmin does have that Fitbit does not is the VO2 max estimate. So Garmin will show you that on the watch itself in the VO2 max section. And then also fitness age, which is essentially an estimate of how old it thinks you are based on things like your resting heart rate, as well as recovery and VO2 max. Okay, so at this point, you're probably asking me like, which one of these darn things do I buy? I just went through like a whole pile of stuff. And the general gist of it would be, if you are more the athletic side, like if you're really focused on athletic and data and geekery and all that kind of stuff, I would probably go with the Garmin. I think it is overpriced. I think the display is, generally speaking, kind of crap compared to the Fitbit display, both in terms of like the brilliance, the colors, all that kind of stuff, but just basic readability. The Fitbit display is clearly more readable than the Garmin display in every possible condition. So that alone, if that's a factor for you, then I would say go Fitbit. Where Garmin excels is giving you all that data and giving it to you for free and giving you as long as you want past, like years of the data. You can go back and trend and look at it, and not just on the app, but on the website, tons and tons of data. Versus Fitbit, it's more about simplicity, which can be great for some people or a hindrance for others. But Fitbit also has some really core features in 2022 that I would expect it would have been on Garmin. For example, contactless payments that's on the Charge 5 is not there on this, again, despite the fact that this is more expensive. Also, we've got the ECG functionality. Garmin doesn't have that launch at this point in time, so that's something that they can't really offer on anything, let alone on this particular device. But Fitbit has that there, and if that's something that you want, well, you can only go to Fitbit. Same goes for AFib detection. Fitbit just last week talked about doing passive AFib detection, which could be a really big deal. They haven't disclosed exactly which devices will get it. The assumption, though, is that it's all the devices that support ECG. So if that's the case, then the Charge 5 will get it shortly here as well. And finally, the last thing I'll probably step back and ask yourself is how interested in things like step tracking and friends and challenges for you. And ultimately, one of the things I've often talked about in activity trackers is your best activity tracker is the one where all your friends are on it. So if all your friends are on Fitbit, I would recommend going with Fitbit. If all your friends are on Garmin, I would recommend going with that, especially if it is to encourage you to do more activity or goals or whatever the case may be, challenges, etc. You're going to do that if your friends are on the same platform versus just you on an island unto yourself. You're probably not going to do as many of those challenges. You're not going to be as healthy. In fact, Fitbit showed a couple years ago in one of the media presentations they did how the more friends you have meant more steps that you did. It was like this direct, crazy relationship between the more connections you had in your Fitbit account meant that you had more encouragement to do more steps. And of course, that same concept would apply on the Garmin side and even Apple and other platforms. But the point there being, if you're by yourself, you're probably going to do less than if you have other people encouraging you. Anyways, hopefully you found this interesting or useful. Again, if you did, whack that like button at the bottom there. It really helps out this video and the channel quite a bit. Or consider subscribing because there's plenty more deep dives and stuff like this down the road. With that, have a good one.